Shortly after Endwalker came out, I made a tier list of all the expansions for Final Fantasy XIV. As the time has passed since then, I don't necessarily disagree with my list, but I think I've come to like Stormblood more and more. While its disjointed nature hasn't become any less of a hindrance, its characters, story and locations are some of my favourites in the entire game. You may be wondering though, why am I talking about Stormblood in my video about Dawntrail? It's because in a lot of ways, Dawntrail feels like Stormblood too. And a lot of the people I know who like this expansion love Stormblood and vice versa. What do I think? Well, Dawntrail isn't quite my favourite, but it's close. While it might be close to being my favourite, what it definitely isn't though is flawless, and a lot of the issues seem to be more down to poor choices than bad design. The biggest complaint I have for this expansion are the vocal performances. They're just awful. Consistently bad between all the characters. A lot of emphasis has been put on Wuk Lamat's voice actor, but she's hardly the only issue. Y'shtola sounds like she's shouting all of her lines down a hallway. It's clearly down to poor direction and choices more than anything though. Everyone involved is capable of good performances. From the normal cast we've heard better delivery in the prior expansions, and Wuk Lamat has great line delivery in the trailer, but for some reason they made her redo the lines in a more flat, less interesting way for the actual game. It's truly baffling and has led to a lot of undue criticism towards the actors themselves. Speaking of, actually, there's been a lot of criticism towards Wuk Lamat as a whole. The voice acting I've mentioned already, but people just seem to get sick of her existence quite quickly. I think she's great. I was happy just about every time she was on screen. A lot of what I read seemed to be that people were upset that she was around too much, that she seemed like the main character of the expansion rather than the Warrior of Light, and like, yeah, that's the point? She is the main character. You're explicitly supporting her on her journey. It honestly baffled me. Dawntrail was clearly set up as her story in the patches leading up to it, and yet people seemed upset that they got exactly what they were told they'd be getting. That's not to say I have no complaints about the story though, and it's also where the comparisons to Stormblood are probably strongest. The first half of the story follows Wuk Lamat as she undertakes the trials required to become the next Dawn Servant, while the second half follows her and Kona as they fend off an invasion from another shard. This is by far my biggest complaint about the expansion. I just don't really care about the second half. Well, that's not quite true, but I'm definitely less interested in it. Following Endwalker, where you literally save the universe, it was pretty obvious where we'd be going next. Y'shtola had been working on how to traverse shards since Shadowbringers, and the post-expansion patches are almost entirely about travelling to the 13th. Clearly then the story would focus on the remaining shards we hadn't been to, or at least it would in the long term. Short term though, we'd need essentially a soft reset to bring the scale back down to a more relatable level. Once you've saved the universe, there isn't any more up to go. This reset would come in the form of what I expected to be basically a beach episode. Wuk Lamat asks you to support her on her journey to become the next Dawn Servant, and that means you'll be travelling to an entirely new continent. The idea of travelling around, learning about the different cultures and the people within while we solve what is essentially just a family dispute sounded great to me. It'd be nice to not have these world-ending, universe-destroying threats to deal with, and relax with a tour of a country hardly anyone had visited, a simple adventure. And then they added a world-ending threat. Predictably, Wuk Lamat fulfills her goals, and after the coronation you're free to do whatever you want. Whatever you want being to go with Erenville across the bridge to Shak Taral and onto his hometown. Or at least, that was the plan. Shortly after arriving, there's a massive earthquake as Alexandria crashes into Yassulani, merging a chunk of the 9th shard with the source. While an already dire situation, things quickly get worse as Alexandria launches an invasion and decimates the population of Tuliolal, all under the leadership of Wuk Lamat's brother. It's not that the second half is bad, I just wanted more of the first. Otis is a great character, the music in the Alexandrian areas are some of my favourite tracks in the game, and the story about what it means to be alive is deeply touching at times, but I also feel like both halves of the expansion needed more time. Imagine if the entire expansion had just been exploring Taral, the Golden City could have been mostly the same, and then the appearance of Alexandria bringing in the post-expansion patches, leading us into the invasion, and an exploration of the entire 9th shard in the next expansion. I just feel like we kind of rushed this new continent. Heavensward is basically just exploring one country, and yet it felt bigger than all of Taral. It's not a physical issue, it's purely because of the time we spend in each area. There's a lot more I want to talk to about all of this, but if I write much more I won't get this video out on time, so I'll just sum up this little bit about how much I like all of the characters. Kona is the machinist catboy I've always wanted to be, and there's a couple of moments in the story where he does exactly what I would have done, usually shooting people in the face. Bakul Jar Jar starts off as a clear villain, but ends up being not just sympathetic, but someone I'd actually be happy to fight alongside. Zoral Jar's outward perfection belies an inner sense of doubt that drives him to commit untold atrocities, and Gulul Jar Jar is an honourable ruler you'd be proud to serve. I do think though that it's quite telling that while I like everything in the expansion, a lot of my favourite stuff is from the first half. The only characters I even have particularly strong feeling towards from the second half are Kokiwa, Queen Sphene, Otis, and Gulul Jar. I guess Nituikwe and the Railyard people too, though they're more Shadowbringers callbacks than anything. Parts of the game are definitely underexplored, like the relationship with Kryl and her parents, and honestly all of Living Memory feels too quick, but there's no part of the story I think is truly bad. If anything, all of my complaints are that I want more. I'd have loved more time with Wuk Lamat, more time exploring Tural, more of Solution 9 to explore. I will say I wish I hadn't known about Solution 9 before going in, but I understand why they had to show it off for the sake of previewing the raids. They'd kind of painted themselves into a corner with that, but it would have been a much cooler reveal if it had been a proper surprise. When I first started writing this video, I wasn't going to talk about anything past the initial release, but considering I've already brought them up, I may as well talk about the raids. For the most part, I've been enjoying them so far. The Arcadian is basically playing through a shonen anime, and the fights are a lot of fun too. Took me a few tries to learn each of them, but once I got it, it was a surprisingly zen experience. The music's great too. Juno, on the other hand, is basically a big advert for 11, and I have to admit it's almost working on me. I've debated it on and off, but I think one day I'll try it out. I will say, so far it's been a bit rough on me though. The bosses aren't too bad until I get to the Shadow Lord, where I can never remember the third swipe. I think my favourite part of it though is spending more time with Bukul Jar Jar and finally getting those tacos he owed me. Dawntrail certainly isn't flawless, but I honestly can't understand the people saying this is the worst expansion, and especially those who've quit the game over it. One thing I've noticed is that the people who complain about Dawntrail are regularly bringing up how long they've been playing for. Maybe they're just trying to qualify their complaints, but I can't help but feel like that's actually where the issues stem from. I've only been playing for a few years, so I've gone through the whole game in a much shorter time frame. Perhaps the people who are the most critical of the expansion are comparing it less to the actual prior expansions and more to their memories of them. Or perhaps I'm talking out of my arse. Honestly, I'm just trying to understand a frame of mind that makes little sense to me. I haven't talked about this in videos before, I don't think, but I don't exactly shy away from it either. If you know me, you know that I've got depression. For me, this presents in a myriad of ways, but one of the main ones is that it's harder for me to feel things. It's actually one of the reasons why I find it so hard to write scripts, because I find it hard to care enough about what I think to write it in a convincing way. Especially if I know a video won't do well, like I don't expect this one to. I bring this up now because 14 is actually one of the few things that reliably makes me feel anything. The sense of wonder when delving into the Jartika heartland for the first time, the gleeful excitement upon finding the greatest serpent of Tural, the chill vibes of Tuliolal at night, the sadness with Gulul Jar Jar's death, my glowing love for Lamachi, also Ral Soj, whose name I just realised I don't know how to pronounce properly. I clearly have a type, but I'm not a furry because I am also a cat. Got a tail and everything. 14 is the only game where I really feel like the character I'm playing. Other games get close, but there's always a disconnect, where in this it just feels like I'm me. Though clearly in real life I'm not a cat. There's a moment in Dawntrail where Wuk Lamat asks you to stay with her after she takes charge, and I honestly felt conflicted. Clearly from a design standpoint you'd never say yes because that would just be the end of the game, but on a personal level I kinda did want to stay with her, and it felt like it would have been a fitting end for my Warrior of Light. I was conflicted though, because for as much as I wanted to stay, I never want to stop exploring. Maybe, almost certainly, the emotional investment I have in 14 makes me view the entire game more favourably than other people do, and I'm trying to not let that override my views, but I just find it so hard to grasp people's complaints about Dawntrail. Honestly, it just kinda makes me sad for everyone involved. While I know not everyone's gonna like everything, I'd certainly like it if more people did. A decent chunk of the player base are unhappy because this isn't where they wanted the story to take them, the developers must be upset by the negative feedback for this expansion they've been making for the last few years, and I'm dejected every time I try to talk to people about this thing that I love because they have a much more negative experience with it than I did. It's a real shame people seem to be having such trouble finding the joy in this expansion that I think is so readily available. If you go back to the tier list I mentioned at the start, I think I'm still happy with the order, but some of my opinions have definitely changed. I still think people are too harsh on A Realm Reborn, but I equally think they're too high on Endwalker, and I think I was at the time, and not to mention Shadowbringers. Heavensward is still probably the best of them all, though those areas could really do with a few more Aetherites. Where would Dawntrail fit in then? Right next to Stormblood. Dawntrail feels like Stormblood 2, and seeing as I loved Stormblood, it's only natural I'd love this as well, but it also has almost the exact same complaints to it. Its halves feel somewhat disjointed, and the storytelling feels a bit rushed, but there's a core to this expansion that I think is not only solid, but is exactly what I wanted after the last 10 years. While Dawntrail isn't perfect, I love it. Just as much as I love the rest of the game, really. Honestly, I don't believe there's anywhere near as much variance between the expansions as people make there out to be. We're talking single points of difference between each. It's like the Dark Souls 2 problem. My biggest complaints are honestly the terrible vocal direction, some of the pacing is a bit quick, and the sheer number of cutscenes now, but that's been a growing problem with each expansion, honestly. Outside of that, I enjoyed every moment I was playing, and honestly wish I could go back and experience it all again. But I guess I'll just have to wait another 2 years till the next expansion. Now excuse me while I go listen to Be My Honey for the millionth time.
Special thanks to my patrons, Justin Wood, Hobbs and Koopy Vegeta. You can join my patrons at patreon.com/Holden Gatsby, check out my TikTok and Twitter at Holden Gatsby, and follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Holden Gatsby. Don't forget to subscribe to all of my channels. If you want more, you can watch my last video now, but if not, then thanks for sticking around. Bye.